Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being invited here today by Dasham Foundation. So I'm the country head of Knight Frank in Cambodia. For those of you not familiar with Knight Frank, we are an international or global real estate consultancy with a presence in over 60 countries. We've had an office here in Cambodia since 2008. I myself, I've been here since 2013, so I'm an 8-year veteran. So I have a sound understanding of the local real estate market. As already mentioned, I will be covering the real estate landscape in Cambodia. The agenda, for those of you that are not familiar with Cambodia, although I'm sure many of you are, I'll just give a very quick macro overview, which certain elements have already been touched upon by the previous speakers. We will then look at the office sector, the retail sector, and the condominium sector. So these historically have been the main real estate sectors that have attracted foreign investment into Cambodia. So without further ado, in Cambodia itself, it's strategically located within Southeast Asia and within ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is one factor that's helping Cambodia to attract foreign investment. So bordered by Thailand to the west, Laos to the north, and Vietnam to the east. So it's straddled between two powerhouses in terms of Ho Chi Minh City and Bangkok. The population, according to the 2019 population census, is 15.6 million people. And the population in Phnom Penh, which is the capital city, is circa 2.1 million. But although a relatively small population, it does have very favorable demographics. So the median age is 26, so it's a very young population. The country also has a very low urbanization rate. Historically, one of the main drivers of the economy in Cambodia has been agriculture. We are seeing this shifting. So the low urbanization rate is a positive thing for the real estate and construction sector, because as people migrate away from the provinces into the main towns and cities, looking for better employment opportunities, better standard of living. That also creates opportunities in the different real estate sectors, and also infrastructure as well, in terms of the connectivity between the provinces and Phnom Penh. In terms of the economy, Cambodia has been one of the fastest growing economies, not just in South Asia, but globally. So during the past 10 years, it's consistently, average GDP growth rate has been recorded at approximately 77%. Obviously, as mentioned previously, COVID has impacted the economic performance during 2020. Although in 2021, the GDP growth forecasts have been revised downwards, but still expected to achieve circa 2.5% for 2021, and to rebound strongly in 2022. That's the hope. Although obviously everyone thought that we would be towards the end of the COVID pandemic, so that does play a key factor. Let's see how 2022 fares. Although Cambodia, in terms of the vaccination program, has been very aggressive, very commendable. At one point, Phnom Penh was the most vaccinated capital city in the world. So, really hats off to the government and how they've managed to contain the pandemic. When we look at the economy, the main drivers in the services sector and also the manufacturing sector. So particularly garment and textiles in terms of export to Europe and the US. So the US and Europe are the main trading partners, or they were pre-COVID with Cambodia. The construction sector has been playing an increasingly important role. And 2019, the construction sector was actually the main contributor to GDP. And we expect that trend to continue once we get past the pandemic and look for a stronger recovery in 2022 and 2023. As previously mentioned, Cambodia is a very foreign investor friendly country. So it's attractive increasing amounts of foreign direct investment. Companies in Cambodia can be 100% foreign owned, which is it's a much more conducive environment compared with the neighboring countries of Thailand and Vietnam in particular. As you already mentioned, that China has been the main source market for FDI into Cambodia. That really has been a trend since 2017. So prior to that, there was a lot of investment, mainly from within the Asia region, certainly Taiwan, Singapore, Korea before the global financial crisis. So it's been quite a diverse source of FDI. But as I mentioned, over recent years, it has been dominated by China, and they are ranked top in terms of FDI into Cambodia, which has focused a lot on the gaming and hospitality sector in the coastal region of Sihanoukville. You can see here in terms of the value of FDI by sector, tourism has certainly been a main benefactor of that FDI coming into the country. So moving on to main infrastructure projects in Cambodia, which has been driving development and construction and also helping to prop up the economy during the pandemic. Some of these have already been touched upon. You have the Phnom Penh International Airport, which was designed by Foster and Partners, which is a well-respected global architectural company. They've worked on some very high-profile projects globally. We also have the Siem Reap International, the new Siem Reap International Airport, which is under construction, as well as the Phnom Penh Sihanoukville Expressway. All of these projects are being constructed by Chinese contractors with different arrangements with the government in terms of how those investments are structured. And what was touched upon in terms of the Southeast Asian Games, which Cambodia will be the host nation in 2023. So the government is really pushing to have these projects operational before the SEA Games. Other projects that are also under construction, major projects, we have Dara Sakor International Airport, which is scheduled to be operational by 2022. This is another very large Chinese developer from the Beijing area, Union Group. So they have a concession for 44,000 hectares. It's a huge project. It's a coastal region. It's the neighboring region for Sihanoukville. So it's a project moving forward that has huge potential, but requires a lot of investment. In Siem Reap, it's a good time to be doing it. They have a project, the 38 road project. So at the moment, the city, all the road networks are under construction, but it's due to be completed by 2022. So really gearing up to be ready for when the market opens again. And another major infrastructure project is in Kampot, which is another coastal province in Cambodia, where they will be constructing a passenger ferry terminal. And this is being funded by the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. So some very good infrastructure projects which are driving demand for development in certain locations within Cambodia. And there are more opportunities in terms of infrastructure development throughout the country. Moving on to the office sector, historically this has been one of the strongest performing sectors, but there has been a lot of construction over recent years. Here we have the supply trend of office space in Phnom Penh. So when I arrived here in 2013, there are actually only 2 high-rise international standard office buildings, purpose-built office buildings. Historically been dominated by villas that had been converted. So, the real estate sector is still very much at a nascent stage of development. It is an emerging market, a frontier economy. But what we can see here in terms of the overall supply of office space, currently in 2021, the existing supply is around 670,000 square meters. But over the next 4 years, that's going to increase significantly. So that will increase by 112%, taking the total to just over 1.4 million. So there is a significant amount of supply forecast to come into the market, assuming that the project's complete as scheduled. Historically, that's been dominated by grade C and grade B buildings, but certainly moving forward and in the development pipeline, a lot more grade A buildings are under construction and will start to come online. So we're seeing a shift in terms of the levels of demand, particularly for grade A buildings and for centrally owned buildings. So at the moment, the existing supply, the split between centrally owned and stratified office buildings is 86 to 14%. But the future supply, which is almost 760,000 square meters, 67% of that will be stratified office buildings. So we're actually starting to see a fragmented market locally where multinational companies want to be located in centrally retained office buildings and not necessarily on stratified buildings due to property management issues. When you have many different owners and trying to manage the building, it becomes a bit more complicated compared with the centrally owned single owner that are holding the asset for long-term investment and rental income. In terms of the demand, again, historically, the supply of office space has been relatively stable. But what we have seen in recent years, because there was an oversupply situation in the condominium market, many developers have switched to the office sector and focusing on stratified office development. And as these developments are nearing completion, we see that the vacancy rate is forecasted to increase significantly to just over 50%. So when you look at the vacancy rate compared with regional countries, it is very high. But in terms of medium-term prospects, we do believe that this will be absorbed into the market. So there's some short-term volatility, which has also been impacted by COVID in terms of many multinationals putting their office relocation and expansion plans on hold. We have seen an uptick in activity during 2021, but that wasn't helped because we had our first lockdown in Cambodia this year in April. Although I have to say we've had it relatively easy compared with neighboring countries in terms of movement restrictions and how that's impacted our day-to-day lives, but it has certainly impacted the economy. Looking at average rents and vacancy rates for prime office space in Phnom Penh. So looking at the grade A buildings, using this as a benchmark, the rental rate, the average rental rate has actually remained relatively stable, trending upwards marginally from 2014 to end of 2019. 2020 is when the COVID pandemic kicked in, and we have seen rental rates start to drop off. And then also the vacancy rate has increased quite dramatically. That's largely due to also incoming supply. So a lot of supply is coming to the market over the last year or so, and we're sure that will be absorbed over the next year or two. Just to give you an idea in terms of how early we are in terms of the development and evolution of the real estate market in Phnom Penh. So there are currently only 5 Grade A buildings in Phnom Penh. Vatanak Tower was the first to complete in 2014, which was developed by a local conglomerate. It was the first international standard LEED rated building in Cambodia. This was followed relatively shortly by Exchange Square, which was developed by Hong Kong Land, which is a big regional developer. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them in Hong Kong. They have many development projects there, and also across the region in Singapore. Satapana Bank was commissioned by Satapana Bank itself, so they occupy a lot of that building, and also leasing out 6 or 7 floors within that tower. Garden in the Air Tower recently completed, and they're doing quite well in terms of take up. And then the final one is Flat Iron, which is a mixed-use building. They have Ascot Group, which will be managing the top section, which will be an apart hotel, and then the remaining floors will be Grade A office space. So it just gives you an idea of the quality of buildings that we have here in Phnom Penh, but also the limited supply and potential future opportunities in the office sector. So just looking at the outlook in terms of opportunities, there are, it's a rapidly growing, or certainly pre-COVID, rapidly growing SME sector, Cambodian SME sector, which is underpinning demand for Grade B and Grade C office buildings. Centrally retained buildings, they have been performing well, still performing well. So we see opportunity there for future development of centrally owned and retained buildings. Surprisingly, there's a fledgling fintech sector in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh. We've actually been approached from some quite large companies in the region and from Singapore as well, looking to set up their HQ here. And it's something that the government has an opportunity to try to cultivate that fintech sector with overarching government policy and incentives to encourage companies to relocate here. Also, in terms of smart buildings and green building opportunities, although it's still a hot topic of conversation, even in more developed markets, in terms of the benefits vis-a-vis the cost of developing green sustainable buildings, and what benefits there are from both the landlord and also the occupier perspective. And what we think we will see is that certainly some of the older buildings which are becoming obsolete, there will be change of use opportunities, while certainly needing to refurbish, renovate, reposition. Looking at the threats, there is still uncertainty around occupier demand. Where is that demand coming from? Most activity over the past 2 years have been companies that are already located in Cambodia, so looking at relocation and expansion. We haven't seen so many new multinationals and other companies coming into the market. Obviously, that's also been impacted by COVID and the quarantine period that was previously in place, but happy to say that quarantine period has been reduced. So we hope that we start to see an increase in foreign investors coming back into Cambodia, but that is yet to be seen. There is a significant amount of office supply coming into the sector. I mentioned before that the supply over the next 5 years will increase by 112%. So from 670,000 square meters up to 1.43 million. So there are certain commentators that would say that we are entering into an oversupply situation, certainly short to medium term. Also, as I mentioned before, in terms of the fragmented market between stratified development and centrally retained development, which is becoming more prominent. As I mentioned, many multinationals don't want to be located in stratified development. And another issue within the office sector is access to skilled labor. So it's quite evident, my experience over the past 8 years, in terms of the increase in salaries for qualified staff has really jumped up dramatically. moving on to the retail sector, and again, you can see here the dramatic increase from when I arrived in 2013, where there were no international standard shopping malls. The first entrant that came into the market was Aeon Mall, which is a Japanese operator. And that has been very successful, was very successful. But you can see here, again, in terms of the significant amount of supply that is coming into the market, which a lot of that is scheduled to complete within 2022, 2023. So the increase in retail supply will be approximately 140% from where we are today to where it's projected to be in 2025. The occupancy rate, the average occupancy rate for retail at the moment is approximately 72%. We forecast that to drop to as low as 60%, 50%. So there's a significant amount of retail space coming into the market. And again, short-term supply, but there are some very positive news that has come in. I mentioned before, in terms of the size of the population has previously deterred the big retailers coming into the market, but that H&M will be coming into the market in 2022. So that is huge in terms of, once one of the big fast fashion retail brands has announced that they're coming in, we expect many to follow. So we believe that will have very positive impacts on the retail sector, and many brands to follow, such as Uniqlo, Gap, Zara, and so on. So we do see a lot of opportunity in the retail sector. In terms of existing retail formats, is dominated by purpose-built shopping centres. There are several retail podiums that have been positioned as more premium products, but they haven't fared so well to date. There's a growing trend of community retail malls. So many of the local developers are developing big landed residential projects, and as part of that, they are anchoring them with neighborhood retail malls to improve the marketability of their developments, and that's becoming a common theme throughout Phnom Penh. In terms of demand, it's a similar story with office, in that over the short to medium term, the vacancy rate is projected to increase quite significantly, inching up to 40%. So it's quite low compared with the region, but there's a growing middle class in Cambodia. Disposable incomes are increasing rapidly. It's an increasingly brand conscious consumer market. So we do see this being a short-term problem, but over the long term, retail certainly has a lot of potential. Here we have, so that there are only two what we would call regional shopping malls currently in Cambodia, and they are both operated by Aeon, which is the Japanese operator. There are several in the pipeline. There's a big local conglomerate, Chipmong Group. They currently have 6 or 7 projects under construction, and one of them will be a mega mall. Again, that was touched upon earlier. So what we're seeing is that international operators have come into the market and they've been successful, and now there are the local conglomerates, the local developers that want to emulate that and also create their own brand, the domestic brand, a Cambodian brand. So there are lots of retail malls in the pipeline, which is why I mentioned there may be some short-term oversupply. In terms of the outlook, increasing disposable incomes. I mentioned before in terms of the favorable demographics, it's a young population, they're increasingly brand conscious, and the increasing disposable income. The major fast fashion brands have yet to enter the market, but with H&M announcing they're coming in next year, we have spoken with several others that are really serious on also coming into Cambodia. So it's very good for the market because prior to that, there was not a lot of options in Cambodia. So people that did have the disposable income were traveling to Singapore, traveling to Thailand. If we can, create a shopping experience that has the brands that they're looking for, then it can be a captive market. And the Cambodian population, they do not need to travel overseas to have access to the brands and the shopping experience that they are experiencing in Thailand and Singapore. The threats, so whilst Cambodia has recorded one of the strongest GDP growth rates over the past 10 years or so, it is from a low base. So the GDP per capita is still quite low. So consumer spending power is also low. I've already mentioned that we are entering into a short to medium term oversupply situation in the retail sector. And also the small population size. This is something that historically has deterred the big retail brands coming into the market, but that is changing rapidly. Again, as I mentioned before, in terms of disposable incomes, the growing middle class, and also the affluent population. So still, many opportunities in retail also. For the condominium sector, and this is where there has been the most foreign investment in the real estate sector in Cambodia, coming from within the region. We've seen cycles. So initially, there was a lot of Korean investment before the global financial crisis. This was then followed by Taiwanese, Singaporean, Japanese investors, and most recently it has been dominated by Chinese investment coming into Cambodia. Again, you can see the significant increase in supply over recent years, and also projected up until 2025. So currently we are standing at around 25,000 existing condominium units, which, when you look at the size of the population of Phnom Penh, it's not actually that many units coming into the market. But one of the problems has been the affordability. So we are seeing an oversupply in the so-called high-end segment, which is not something that the so-called mass market in Cambodia at the moment, they cannot afford this level of high-end condominium development. One thing to look at in terms of the sales rate. So we monitor the total overall supply of condominium units in the market, and you can see that the sales rate has been trending down. So and below 20%, which is quite low compared with other countries in the region. Although the number of units being sold has remained relatively consistent, but there's been a significant increase in supply. So that's led to the overall sales rate declining. There has been pressure on rental rates and also development prices. I was quite surprised. I lived in Malaysia before coming to Cambodia, and the accommodation there was affordable. And when I moved to Cambodia, I thought that I'd be able to rent similar accommodation but at lower prices. But surprisingly, because of the supply-demand scenario, prices were quite high compared with Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur. But what we've seen in recent years is that rental rates have certainly started to trend down, which I think is very good for the country in terms of affordability and being able to attract more expats to the market. And this has been mirrored really in terms of the trend of developers selling prices, which has been trending down to 2018. There was a peak upwards up until beginning of 2020, but certainly since then with COVID, the selling prices have dropped back down. Just looking at some of the so-called luxury developments in Phnom Penh. So these are a selection of some of the most expensive completed condominiums in Phnom Penh. We have the Peak, which is it's a mixed-use project. It comprises 2 towers of residential. It's anchored by the Shangri-La Hotel and a luxury retail podium. This was a joint venture between local company Wheble and Singapore's Oxley Group. So this project was selling at around $5 per square meter on net area, which I know sounds very cheap compared with the Hong Kong prices, but it was record prices at the time of launch. Sky Villa is a Taiwanese development. It was actually designed by the architect that designed Taipei 101. This is a premium service residence, which it provides 5-star level of hotel service, and it just shows the direction that the market is moving in. And then Picasso City Garden, which is also a Taiwanese investor. And this comes fully furnished, and they actually signed an MOU with Picasso Group, which is part of the Picasso's estate, the world famous artist. So their selling prices have reached $7,000-8,000 per square meter, setting benchmarks in the market. But one of the biggest issues in Cambodia to date has really been the quality of construction in the market. So that's where I think there are certainly opportunities for quality construction companies coming into the market and improving the overall standard of build quality and safety, construction safety as well, which is something that's lacking really in Cambodia. So moving on to the outlook for the condominium sector, in terms of where there's opportunities, which is affordable housing, I know it's not so attractive to developers and contractors, very low margins, and typically requires government subsidies, which we are moving towards. There are certainly some tax incentives to incentivize developers to provide affordable housing. One of the issues is the cost of land and, again, infrastructure. So when you're developing affordable houses, they need to be located in outside city locations, but you need to have the connectivity and infrastructure that enables people to commute into the city centre for employment. So we do see this area as having huge potential. Another area as well, this is a global trend in terms of super luxury and branded residents, which they have been a standout performer during the pandemic, with people wanting to be located within projects that are full service and have access to full amenities in case there's another lockdown, and people are cooped up in their buildings. They want to have open spaces, gymnasiums, swimming pools, and so on, and to have that level of luxury provided by branded residence operators. Also, the domestic market as well. So there's been increasing demand from the Cambodian market for condominium living, which we certainly saw in 2020. So foreign investment did drop off in 2020 due to the travel restrictions, but the domestic demand went some way to offset that drop off in foreign investment. So it's certainly a market that can be tapped into. And I mentioned before in terms of rapid urbanization rate, which is leading to increased traffic congestion, and is leading more people to want to live in the city centre, so for high-rise condominium level living. And again, just touching on infrastructure, I know there have been some feasibility studies for mass transit, so sky trains maybe similar to Bangkok, to Kuala Lumpur, and this is something that moving forward really needs to be looked into more detail. I know other studies there have been questions in terms of payback periods and how private companies, private sector can work with the government in terms of public-private partnerships, build, operate, transfer agreements. So certainly something that needs to be explored further, and where there are opportunities here in Cambodia between the private sector and the government sector. In terms of threats, it is a similar theme. I don't want to be painting a bad picture in terms of short-term oversupply. There is an oversupply in the high-end condo sector, but it is a short-term problem, certainly over the medium and longer term, as for any real estate sector to be sustainable, it needs to be driven by domestic demand. So I believe over the next 5 years or so, as disposable incomes continue to increase, access to finance and also cost of finance will also drive demand across all the different real estate sectors. Yeah, again, opportunity and potential, but there will be some short-term volatility which hasn't been helped by the COVID situation. So everyone's hoping for a strong rebound in 2020. So let's hope that happens. And yeah, that concludes my overview of the market.